Shalom to all. My name is Rabbi Sivan Mas, and I am the Dean of the IISHJ, Tmura, Israel, greeting you from Jerusalem. Today, with a deep sense of obligation to generations past, we have formed a partnership between the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism, Tmura, in Israel, and the Institute in North America, together with the Society for Humanistic Judaism, to take part in the Israel Holocaust Day commemoration lecture series. As humanists, we are committed to combating racism wherever it appears and to instilling a rich culture founded on the principles of respect for human dignity, freedom, and equality. In this series, Committed to Memory, Holocaust Memorial Day 2020, we have invited graduates and current fellows of Tmura to share ideas. We're especially honored today to hear from Professor Yehuda Bauer, one of the founding members of the Israeli and North American Secular Humanistic Institutes, together with Rabbi Sherwin T. Wine, Professor Yaakov Malkin, Supreme Court Judge Chaim Cohen, and other distinguished scholars and visionaries. Before I present our first speaker, I would like to personally thank Mr. Paul Golin, who is the director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, and Dr. Rabbi Adam Shalom, who is the dean of our Secular Humanist Institute in North America, on putting together this meaningful partnership today. Together with their respective leadership, the presidents of the organizations, their boards and staff. Please keep your microphones on mute so we can all enjoy the speakers. We are fortunate today to have with us Dr. Avi Rose, who is a Jerusalem-based educator, artist, and psychologist. His research and teaching explores aspects and interactions of psychology, culture, and art in Israeli and Jewish context. He serves as the Director of Academics and Education for Young Judea and is a fellow of Tmura, the Israel Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism. So Avi, we're happy to have you with us today. The screens are yours.
Wonderful. First of all, I want to make sure that everybody can hear me.
We can hear you well.
Lovely. All right. Hello, everybody. Some faces I definitely recognize and some people I have yet to meet. I want to say that I'm incredibly honored to be here with you today to begin what for all of us is a difficult and challenging week of memorial. And I have to say quite honestly that given the topic and my connection to it, which I'll explain to you in a few minutes, I feel somewhat humbled being in the presence of this incredible body of work known as Art from the Holocaust. My goal for the time that I have is to leave you wanting more, for you to finish this little taster menu and say, oh, you know what, that was a good beginning, but I'd like to delve into it. And that's because this topic is both very wide. There's a lot of art that was produced during the period of the Holocaust. And also it tends to be a field that people don't explore as much, even people who are interested in Shoah. So I really am excited to share with you. The stories are not, of course, not simple or easy, but the people who are behind this art, in as far as we know who they are, have left us with an incredible, incredible gift. And it's that I want to touch on in the presentation that I have. And that is, what do we do with this gift? How do we make use of it in the generations to come when the people who survived the Holocaust will no longer be around? I want to point out that I spend the majority of my time teaching younger people, and they are going to be the ones who chiefly are going to be tasked with this job of trying to make sense and tell the story of the Holocaust. And I think that art is one of the ways to do it. Now, the central theme that's going to follow of what I'm going to talk about is really twofold. One is this brief introduction to the art and some of the artists that produced work during the Shoah. And the other is to make a comment about the power of art itself, to use this art as a lens to look at the human experience, at the human spirit, and the way in which the veracity of that spirit can come out even in the most difficult of conditions. So I'm sure that among you, there are people that know lots about Holocaust and lots about art, and probably some of you that know a little bit of both. But I want to share with you my journey, how I got involved in the world of looking at art from the Shoah. Like many people of my particular generation, my first exposure to art that emerged from the period known as the Holocaust was from the book I Never Saw Another Butterfly. Along with the Diary of Anne Frank, that was for many of us in our generation, the first exposure that we had to the story of the Holocaust. It was child-friendly, it was something that we could relate to. And it also gave us these hooks, these human stories on which to be able to hang whatever it was that we could make sense out of this event that had no sense in it. And these images stayed with me for a very long time. I tried several times in my college life to make sense out of them and make order. And as I started to learn art history, I wanted to apply the skills that I was learning as an art historian to understand and to categorize and do the things that I saw. I came to the conclusion at the end of at least one of the major papers I wrote at the end of college that there was no way to apply those particular skills. In other words, art that emerges from the Holocaust is not like art that emerges from anywhere else. It is really its own thing. And it took me many years to sort of sort out for myself what that thing was. And it was really when I became an educator and I started working with people and trying to explain the story of Jewish art, that firstly, I felt that there was no way to talk about Jewish art as a large body without at least mentioning and delving into the images that emerged from the Holocaust. And the second thing is I had to be able to make sense of it so that I could share whatever power that art had. And that's when it hit me. It hit me that this is really about the power of visual communication. It's about the power of the creative spirit. And ultimately, it's about the power of human beings. Now, before we dive into looking at examples of art from the Shoah, I want to make mention of the fact that one of the first people to catch on to the power of art was Hitler. And in fact, Hitler, who himself was a somewhat failed artist, tried very hard at the beginning of his regime to control art. Art at the early part of the 20th century had undergone this major, major revolution. People were using art to make personal and political statements, to fight against regimes, to dream up new realities and social structures. There was something ultimately very democratic about art, something that was relatively new in the history of art, and something that Hitler and the Nazis decided was antithetical to what they were trying to achieve. And so they declared it to be degenerate. Any art that didn't fit into their worldview was considered to be sickly. And it is from that a special exhibit was put together in 1937 of art that was largely looted from families and from galleries that was considered to be degenerate. Interestingly, when I talk about this, and normally if I was teaching a class, I'd spend much more time talking about what that art was, but I want you to see this particular image to see already what the power of that art was. Here's a group of people lined up, it looks like around the block, to be able to see this work. Although it may be that they were forced to do so, or at least pressured into doing it, I like to think that they were trying to get a last look at this incredible body of work that was about to disappear from their society. In its place, Hitler put in an exhibit called the Great German Art Exhibition the same year. And as you can see from this photo, it was about art like a society that was going to bend to the will of its one and only leader. This is what was considered to be official sanctioned art in the Nazi regime. It reflects all of the racist stereotypes and the gender stereotypes and the family grouping stereotypes. Although as a psychologist, I love to kind of get into this and take a look at it and kind of analyze what's going on, because there's a lot of sort of strangeness there. But this was what was considered to be the aesthetic, the way in which the world was supposed to look in this particular regime. Along with it, there was a great body of work that was produced to help the Nazis encourage people in their anti-Semitism. The piece that you see on your left is from a children's school book called The Poisonous Mushroom that was distributed to teach children in Nazi Germany had to spot a Jew and all the terrible things that Jews were going to do. The piece on the right is an illustration from a newspaper article, and you can see what the writer and the artist is trying to get at. And so as we enter into the Holocaust, art is really kind of clamped down. It feels like there's an end to a certain level of freedom and artistic spirit that had been going, and ironically, had been growing strong really largely in Germany, the center of which was Berlin. However, as you can imagine, art isn't going to be kept down for very long. And what I'd like to do in this very brief period of time is show you art from different places from within the Shoah. I've done them by physical location, and we'll talk about particular artists and different styles and different messages that people were trying to get. The first place we'll look at is art from people in hiding. I love this piece. It's painful. It's almost too painful to look at for very long. It's done in Holland, where there were a large number of Jews that were being hidden. It's important to see in this piece what the artist is saying about life in this hiding place, somewhere between life and death, really nowhere, kind of hanging in this space of nothingness. The most famous artist to emerge from the hiding period for people is a man named Felix Nussbaum. Now, Nussbaum originally was German and began working on his career in Paris, where he lived with his wife, when he was taken in 1940 to one of the early versions of a camp. It's not clear if it was a work camp or a concentration camp. He then escapes and goes into hiding in Belgium, where he lives for the next 4 years. What's incredible about Nussbaum's work is, first of all, the level of professionalism. Imagine, if you will, a person is living in hiding. There's almost no food. There's no daylight. There's no fresh air. There's really no space to have a studio. There's barely space to live. And yet Nussbaum produces this amazing body of work that gives us insight into what it was like to be in his position. First of all, he shares, once he gets into hiding, his memories of what it was like to be in a camp. But most importantly, he shares with us what life was like in hiding. In this particular piece, we see the symbols of his Jewish identity, along with this eerie map of the world that is being shadowed over. What especially appeals to me or pulls me in is Nussbaum's depiction of the outside being no friendlier or safer than the inside. So although the female figure is staring out, longing to be out in the world, there really is no world of any substance or safety for her to be out of. They are really stuck in between life and death. As Nussbaum stays in hiding, he begins to do more self-portraits that show us what physically happens to him. And in some prophetic way, very shortly before he and his wife were captured and sent to die in Auschwitz, he produces this incredible, frightening piece. I don't know if it was meant to reflect his own personal death, which was coming up, or if in some way it was meant to talk about the death that the world was experiencing. It's very much in the surrealist style. We see lots of art that comes after the Holocaust that uses surrealism as a way to talk about it. But Nussbaum is one of the first people during the Shoah to give us this kind of insight into the world. We then move on to the largest body of work, which is art that's produced by prisoners, people living in ghettos, in concentration or death camps. I want to go back to Theresen, that first camp from which the early art that I saw in my childhood produced by children, and show you this incredible example. The reason that I feel that this piece is incredible, and there are so many of them, and I want to tell you that after many, many years of learning and seeing this stuff, when I finally got to go to Theresen and see face-to-face the art, I felt like I was meeting old friends. And when I saw this piece, tears came to my eyes. And I wanted to touch it. Of course, I couldn't. It was sort of there through glass. But I really felt that I knew this person. I knew this child. I knew the dreams that they had. From a technical perspective, what's really important about this piece is what it's made of. the little bits and pieces of nothing that were carved together to create art. And here we have the second way in which art is such a powerful business. I'm going to show you lots of pieces of art that were created in hellish circumstances. It's not clear how people got a hold of these materials. It's not at all clear how they were shared. We know that in Terezin, there were adults that gave art lessons. There were artists that stole materials from an art workshop I'll tell you about in a couple of minutes and shared them with children. That we know. How people did it and why they did it remains one of the big questions of the power of art in the context of the Holocaust. This is another example that I especially love. This artist, as you can see from multiple examples, took some old form, and we see by the date that they predate the Holocaust by several decades. They must have been leftover forms of some kind that somebody had access to. And in just that little L shape, they produced these incredible pieces of work. They're bright, they're full of life, exactly the opposite of what this person was living in that particular moment. And they speak to the fact that creativity grows very much like wildflowers in between the cracks, that somehow life finds a way, even if it's in a tiny little box at the corner of an old piece of paper. Here's art that was meant to be given away. These are greeting cards that were created in the various camps, meant to bring somebody joy, meant to bring blessing, meant to give people a sense of normalcy in completely abnormal times. I want to think about the people that took the trouble and somehow risked themselves to create these pieces just to give somebody else a little moment of joy, of laughter. In the Warsaw Ghetto, some of you who have studied about the Holocaust might know, I only learned about this a few years ago when I had the opportunity to visit Warsaw. There was a massive project that was started by the people there to save an archive of Jewish existence. They were worried that ultimately the Nazis would succeed in wiping out the Jews, and they wanted to maintain some record of not just what happened in the Warsaw Ghetto, but what happened to the Jewish people. And interestingly, included among lots of documents and papers and different items and photographs, there's a fair bit of art. There are at least 300 examples of art from one artist alone. Here we have something very simple, a child's Hebrew homework, a statement about Zionism, a statement about Jewish peoplehood, a statement about life. And we know that in the ghetto, there were schools and there were all kinds of organizations that kept people going. This is some kind of youth paper, some kind of newspaper or magazine that was done for one of the Zionist youth groups. I had the privilege of doing a dry run of this today with a group of the people that are the descendants of these early youth movements. And they were fascinated to see this piece and to see that their movements somehow were thriving in the ghetto. And here's a piece of art that sadly tells the reality of life. These are a group of children who were caught by one of the Nazi officers smuggling food into the ghetto. I return us to Terezin. Terezin is a very important place in the story of art and the Shoah, because there was a large number of artists who were brought together and forced to create art for the Nazis. In this particular piece, you see those artists at work. They produced posters trying to get people to willingly get on trains and go to the concentration camps. They produced fake money, trying to ruin the economies of places like the United Kingdom and the United States. And behind the backs of the Nazis, a group of these artists made a decision to steal supplies and to tell the real story of what was going on in Terezin. Led by this man, Bendrich Frita, who we see here drawing an official drawing that the Nazis made to tell people about how good the conditions were going to be, right before they created an actual movie set. Some of you might know this, that in Terezin there was a film that was made to fool people into thinking that the living conditions were good. Frita steals materials and creates this piece called Behind the Facade to tell the real story of what was going on in Terezin, just in case people didn't know. He and his fellow artists risked their lives stealing the material and hiding it in various places to tell that truth. This is Felix Bloch, who spent a fair bit of time talking about the elderly population that was basically abandoned in Terezin with no one to look after them. Like the children, they were thrown away when they were in that midpoint from where they started to where they would end up in Auschwitz. Leo Haas, who becomes a very close friend of Frita's, tells the story of daily life in this particular concentration camp. But Frita didn't want to just tell the negative story. He wanted to share the life that was created in Terezin. And we know that there were lots of cultural activities, there were educational activities, there were religious activities. There was actually a synagogue that was discovered in the basement of one of the places. And right before Bendrich Frita and his wife were deported to Auschwitz, he created this book for his 3-year-old son, Thomas. This was meant to give Thomas a glimpse of what the world could look like outside of the camp. And interestingly, Leo Haas adopts Thomas after his parents are killed, and the two of them spent a great deal of time preserving this artwork and telling the story of the people from the Terezin concentration camp. Even in the most hellish of places, we see art. This is a piece of art that is sandwiched between the bunks in Auschwitz and Birkenau. This particular piece is once again meant to tell the true story of what happened to people. These were people that were forced to build a canal in the camp and how they were beaten. But just as powerful and maybe even more beautiful are these pieces that were found, again, sandwiched secretly in between bunks. This, a picture of the land of Israel. This, a memory of more maybe happy times, maybe more fulfilled times. And the piece that really, you'll pardon me if I kind of get choked up, the piece that really always speaks to me is this piece. Created anonymously for children who were anonymous and would never know who the person was, to give them on their way to being killed in the gas chambers some little glimpse, some little moment into what childhood would have looked like. Now, I want you to understand that there were only 2 ways that people could have gotten art materials. One was by stealing it, and the other was by trading whatever meager supplies or possessions they had. And since we know that people had most of their possessions taken away, it meant that they gave away their food. In either circumstance, they risked their lives to create this art. And I ask myself, I ask you, what is it about creating art that makes people want to do it, even under these most horrible conditions? And more so, what makes people want to create art when their life is at risk? When instead of giving them life, it could cause them death. At the end of the war, art takes on a new role, a role as a testimony, as a witness to what happened in the concentration camps. During the famous Eichmann trials here in Jerusalem, a woman was giving testimony and she was shown this document, a book that was created by a young woman named Zofia. Nobody knew who she was. Nobody knew what had happened to her. They knew that she was a talented graphic artist, and they knew that she had captured images of the women's camp in Birkenau. The woman who gave the testimony, whose name I sadly don't remember, used these images to help create a narrative that was used in the central part of the Eichmann trial. It was many decades before the book was finally handed over to Yad Vashem, and it was discovered that the artist was a woman named Naomi Yukovsky, who lives on Kibbutz Lochamei Ghettoot. She had long told her children about the album, but didn't know what happened to it. And sadly, she and the album would never meet. A few months after she died, Yad Vashem was able to finally put it on display, and only several years later was the mystery of this album solved. These are the images that come from this album. These are the women being prepared, their heads shaven and deloused. These are the living conditions. And these are women being beaten. What speaks to me so much about this, other than the clarity of the art, is the kind of power and anger that this woman brings. And it screams to me. It tells the story in this intense, intense way, in a way that I think millions of words couldn't do. And I'm proud as someone who loves art and someone who has fallen in love with this version of art, that this was used as part of the official testimony to tell the story of the Shoah. And when times are better, I want to invite you to come to Yad Vashem, where you can see this album. It now sits proudly on display in a special gallery that Yad Vashem has put together. The last piece of testimony art that I want to show you comes from a somewhat controversial figure. His name is David Ulrey. Ulrey was one of the Sonderkommando, one of the people whose job it was to take bodies from the gas chambers and have them burnt. These were people that were handpicked by the Nazis. They were, as you can see in this picture, very carefully screened and often sent to die themselves because the Nazis did not want these people to live. They didn't want them to tell the story. They were hated by the other people in the camp, and even after the Holocaust, they were treated with a great deal of resentment and suspicion. Ulrey takes his art and humanizes this experience. These are not for the weak of heart. These show the reality of what it meant to do this job that was so hated by the people who did it and those who resented them doing it in the first place. It shows you that this was not a clean act, that this was a painful, difficult, constantly deathly act. And here, in what I think is Ulrey's most important contribution to the story of the Shoah, is a piece that depicts people that are hanging between life and death. In the camp, this was known as being a Musulman, a person whose body continued to function when their human spirit had gone. Ulrey shows us this first and foremost to tell us about this phenomenon. Viktor Frankl, the famous psychoanalyst, talks about this in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. He talked about the fact that some people would give up on life while other people would somehow continue. Now, they had the same circumstances. Frankl had his explanation. Ulrey is just showing us what it really looked like. I'm going to take a break in a moment to have Sivan read out some of your questions, and I'll come back and finish off my remarks. But in the interim, I want you to know that what you're seeing here is both incredibly powerful in terms of the story that it's telling, but also incredibly powerful in terms of what it's saying about humanity. And so with that, I'll be pleased to take some questions.
Okay, so we don't have any questions yet
Okay.
from people using the chat. I just want to say something technical. We have passed the 100 mark. In other words, there are over 100 people who are listening today. We may have a technical problem and we may have to send you another link to the next lecture. We don't know why, but I will tell you about it later. But at this point, Avi, I have a question. And my question to you is, how do your students relate to this? I know you work with young people in their late teens or early 20s. What is their reaction to this?
Surprisingly, their reaction to it is very natural. In other words, they dive into this. They want to be with this. It could be that my kind of crazy passion for talking about this art and showing this art and kind of exposing the pain of this art draws them in. But also I think that there is something very relatable about this work. They can understand the human stories that go with it. They can try and make sense of how a human being would do something, some kind of rebellious act like create art or store art. It makes sense to their young minds that that's what a person would do. I think in many ways, they're also closer to being in touch with understanding art as a natural form of human expression. I think the older we get, the more afraid we are and the more we lose our connection to this. My theory and what I take forward in the work I do with them and also with educators is that art, like almost all of the other skills that we have in life, is natural to us. It just falls away. We stop getting involved with it. We decide that other things are more important. And I think when they see that in the context of the Holocaust, there was nothing more important for these people than visual communication. and also coupled with the fact that they're becoming a much more visually communicative generation. The written word is less and less important. So for them, this is really natural. This makes a lot of sense. It also is a way for them to understand the Holocaust in light of the fact that they get it, that there are fewer and fewer people around to tell the story. And I always start by saying what I said to everybody today, that this art is really going to be one of the few things that will be left for us to be able to tell the story when there are no survivors. And the fact that I was so touched by it at such a young age, and it continued to be with me throughout the work that I've done, both as an artist and as an educator, I think somehow I can share that with them, and they can understand that they too can use this tool in what is going to be a very, very difficult battle for them to continue the story of the Shoah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, yes, Debbie Pollock in Winnipeg. Thank you, Avi, for that excellent presentation. I just have a question. Is there a book a compilation of all the various artists' artwork from the Shoah that is available?
So the easy answer is that there are lots of books that are available. The two places that I go to are more online sources, mostly because I always take, rather than reading a book, I sort of take the work and I transfer it over onto the screen. And the two places I go to are Kibbutz Lochamei Ghettoot, the Ghetto Fighters Museum in the northern part of Israel, and Yad Vashem itself, which has a large collection. Both of those places do produce books. There are many books that you can look at about Holocaust and art. As I said before, I think that if you're an art historian, this is difficult territory to get involved in. You might be able to categorize it and talk about it, but how do we pass judgment on this kind of art? How do we use the same tools that we use to talk about a Michelangelo or a Picasso when we're talking about this? So the kinds of books you're going to get are going to be testimonial books. They're going to be books that are going to talk about specific camps. There's going to be different places, but we can certainly do some research together for people that are interested in print material to see what is out there. But I do know that both Yad Vashem and Kibbutz Lochamei Ghettoot produce materials both online. My guess is also that the very important Holocaust Museum in, I think it's Washington, pardon my lack of understanding America, I'm kind of Canadian and Israeli. But I believe that the museum is in Washington, and it would also be an incredible resource to look into this.
Thank you.
Few other questions that are sent privately in the chat instead of for everyone. That's why I missed them. So there are a few. So let me read out to you a few of the questions, and then maybe you can answer sort of all together. So are there any examples of artwork from these artists from before the Shoah? Do we learn anything from seeing their art from before? That's one question. What can you share about how Holocaust art influenced more modern art in Israel and around the world? What happened to Buleria? Where is the last wonderful, if one can say that, painting? I would like to ask if there is a significant difference between art created in different places during the Holocaust.
Okay, those are amazing questions. And Sivan, being a good educator, Sivan is my teacher, she fired them all off at the same time, and there's no way I'm going to remember them all.
So pick whatever you remember.
David Ulrey lived to a ripe old age. He was able to continue his work. A lot of his work is actually created after the Holocaust. If you take a look at the piece that's in front of us, and it really is a hard piece. I'm going to move around in a second. I actually want to show you something else that I skipped over a zillion slides ago, because we in Tmura are very time conscious. There's a kind of Yeka mentality that we work with there, which I can only relate to on half of my genetic line. Ulrey worked here. You can see it's, I think it's 1947 that he's producing this piece, and that's why. And that's why it feels different than the other pieces of work. It has more time, it's more considered. You can look up Ulrey on Wikipedia, you can see some of his work. You can find out about the career that he had afterwards. He did some incredible things. I love all these questions. They're really amazing. And after the session that I had earlier in the day where the young people asked questions that just kind of blew me away, I'm kind of getting used to these wonderful questions. I want to address the question because it still sticks out in my mind, and then Sivan can help me with the other ones. There are differences in art that you can see from the different locations. In other words, different narratives and different stories and different conditions. For example, Theresian had more art supplies that were available to people that they stole. So there'll be one particular kind. What's interesting to me, and I apologize if I'm not being specific enough, but what really is interesting to me is this kind of confluence of the idea that people needed to create art that either celebrated life or documented the reality of what was going on. It happens in Warsaw, and it happens in Theresian, and it happens in... Oops. I want to go back and show you this very, very beautiful piece that I just came across when I was getting ready for this presentation. Where is it? Here it is. I'll go back. Okay. This is created by a young girl who was in hiding in Poland. Now, I guess I knew from some personal stories about people hiding in Poland. You don't normally think about it. This is a woman named Nellie Toll, and when she was written about in the New York Times a few years ago, she was already at the ripe old age of 80. She had continued to do art after she was liberated from the camps and made a life for herself in New Jersey. And what happened is that she wrote a story, a kind of feminist version of Cinderella, in which Cinderella doesn't end up with Prince Charming, but ends up with her best buddy. They go live in a castle and they play music together. Her mom, just like the people in the Warsaw camp and the Warsaw Ghetto and in Theresian concentration camp, understood the power of this piece of work. And she took whatever possessions she had apparently and paid the people who were hiding them in Poland to further hide this body of artwork so that after the war there would be some memory of this young woman. Now, I don't know if the mother survived. I do know that Nellie did. And two of these pieces were included in an exhibit that was put on. First of all, I think it's a beautiful piece of work for an 8 or 9-year-old girl. But second of all, I want you to get that although there probably were these regional differences, it's the similarities that are exciting to me. That different human beings in different circumstances came up with the same idea. So I see some other questions. Sivan, you want to remind me of some of the ones I forgot?
Wait.
Okay.
I have to see because I can't see it on the screen.
Okay, I'm just going to go back to where I wanted to be when we finish. So I apologize.
Okay, that's fine. There was one question about places. Did geography or the situation change anything?
Right, so that I addressed that. I also want to make mention of the fact that that there are artists, Nussbaum, for example, there are good examples of his work from before the war.
That's right.
He was a surrealist and he did the work. What the students this morning noted about his work was how he kind of kept true to his surrealism, that although his circumstances had changed and clearly his body changed, you can see that in the pieces that he paints, he remains committed to his language, to the way in which he does his style. This piece here that you're looking at, which I also skipped over, is an incredible piece by a man named, I think it's Yaakov Bacon. I remember his last name, obviously, because it's not a pretty common Jewish name. I think you get it here about the human head coming out of the smokestack. Bacon did a lot of work both before the Holocaust and survived and did this work, and that's why he's in the category of testimony. The other question I do remember that is very important is what happens afterwards. Now, when I teach this in a longer format, I do talk, there's a whole other section that I give on what happens to art after the Holocaust. Art that's created by survivors, art that's created by subsequent generations of people, the children and now grandchildren of survivors, people who are just artists and are interested in it. There's a lot of very powerful examples. There is language that is borrowed from this art, and a lot of it you do see repeatedly in Israeli art and in generally in art that deals specifically with Jewish issues in the Shoah.
So there's sort of one more question. There's more than one, but I'll take the last one, which is I'd like to know how and why Dr. Rose decided to focus his work on Holocaust art, which I think you mentioned in a way, but maybe as we're coming to closure, I will give the screen back to you in just a minute, and then you can answer that. I just wanted to tell you two things. One is that this is really a series of lectures. Most of them are in Hebrew, except for this wonderful partnership today, which is in English. And we find that people are interested, and this is very important for them. So for those of you who are Hebrew speakers, on Yom HaShoah, which is Tuesday, Israel Holocaust Day, we will have a program. So if you are a Hebrew speaker, you are more than welcome to join us. You can always write to our email, which is a very simple one, and I will put it also in the chat. It is tmuraisrael@gmail.com. So you are invited to that. Just before I give the screen back to Dr. Rose, I just wanted to mention that Professor Bauer is already with us here. Hello, happy that you're here. And we will hear his lecture. We do have a technical problem, and that is that for some strange reason, we are limited to at this point, to 100 people who are listening to us. We did pay Zoom so that we can have more than that. So we will have a link very, very soon, which we will put in the chat, and you can go from the chat directly there. In the meantime, stay with us. We're going to be here. Avi is going to finish the talk, and then we will have some music as we are preparing for the next lecture. So please don't go away. We will find a solution. So Avi, please continue.
So I do want to finish with a couple more images. And then if there are other questions that we don't get to in the time limit that we have, I'll be very happy to answer them, either if this is recorded and we can get the questions off the chat, or you can write to Tmura and I'll be happy to write you back with any answers or links, or to share any of the images if you'd like them. The lovely question about how Dr. Rose got involved in this has two very simple answers. First and foremost, Dr. Rose is the son of Dr. Rose, and that Dr. Rose spent many years teaching about the Shoah, and it was language that was talked about in our home, and it was something that I kind of grew up on. And also, I had the privilege of being taught by many Holocaust survivors. And Debbie is out there, and she and I know that story from our days at the Talmud Torah and Winnipeg of art and engaging people in art. If I were to do this with my own students, we would do art at the end of this to respond to it. This is one of the areas of talking about Judaism as a culture that I think is incredibly important. So for me, there is no teaching of Jewish art. I want to end, I'm going to zip through a little bit. I want to end on something a little more, I think, in line with what my personal philosophy is. Of all of the art that I've shown you today, the art that I go back to when I just sit there, often it's the end of a class or when I'm preparing a class, are these. These are portraits. These are portraits of people. And they've become incredibly important to me. I don't know who these people are. In some cases, I know who the people were that painted them. I don't know anything about them. And I was reminded of a story of a very famous photo album called the Auschwitz album that tracks the story of a community that was photographed as it arrived at Auschwitz and as they were processed and killed. And the album was just there. It was found at the end of the Holocaust. And one survivor, the lone survivor from this community, was able to identify these people. And what it taught me was that the real tragedy of the Holocaust is, in addition to the massive loss of life, was the loss of humanity. Because not only did those people die, but everybody who knew them, everybody who had a sense of who they were in the world, they also died. And I go back to these images because what they give back to these people, what they give to all of us, is a sense of humanity. And I want to say this. If I started by talking about the power of the visual as a communication method, the power of the human spirit, the need under the most difficult circumstances to create art, the only answer I have to it is that art somehow returns our humanity to us. It is a reflection, it is a unique human art form, creating visual art, but it is something that ultimately is very human about all of us. And all we can do is look at these images now. All we can do is try and look into the eyes of these people, to see the shapes of their face, to try and imagine who they were, what a conversation would have been with them, and to know that this is our part. This is what we can do to keep that memory going. And so I want to wish you a journey into looking more into the art of the Holocaust, whatever it was, whatever area that you saw. But that the next time you do see a piece of work produced about the Holocaust or by the Holocaust, take a moment and remember these faces. Take a moment and thank them for being part of the human family. And I want to thank you for spending this time with me.
Well, thank you very much, Avi.